Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the third Thursday Science webinar series of the European Marine Board. I am Sheila Heymans, the Executive Director of the European Marine Board, and I will be your moderator today. Just some housekeeping rules quickly before we go into the webinar. Please make sure that you have your name clearly entered so that when you ask a question, we know who you are. If you have questions, please use the Q&A at the bottom of the screen to ask any questions. The chat function that we have, you can use for any technical support that you might need. And in the Q&A, please let us know who you are, what organization you're from, so that we have some idea of that. And at the end of the talk, I will read out your questions from there to the speaker. Also be aware that this webinar is being recorded and live streamed on YouTube. So if you handle accordingly, obviously, and you'll be able to see the re-watch it on our website and on our YouTube channel. So with all of that out of the way, the focus of our webinar today is actually about the science following from and behind our position paper number 18 on achieving ecologically coherent marine protected area networks in Europe, the science needs and the priorities. The speaker today is Dr. Joachim Claudet. He is a senior researcher and ocean advisor from CNRS in France and CRIOBE in Tahiti. And he is going to be giving us a talk on marine protected areas. So I think stop sharing my screen now. And Joachim, welcome. It's lovely to have you here. If you will share your screen, that would be great. And I think I will let you go. We can't hear you. Oh, there we go. You're mute.
Can you hear me?
Perfect.
So yeah, thank you. I'm really glad to be here with you today. Thank you for the invitation. So I will be presenting something about the MPA guide, which is and try to show how this can be useful to track global goals for the ocean. So first, as you all know, I will be very brief on that. Obviously, our well-being depends on a healthy ocean. And why that? Because there are a lot of co-benefits in between achieving SDG 14, so the ocean SDG, and many other SDGs. So acting for the ocean is not something that is being done in isolation towards other sustainable development goals. However, the ocean is highly threatened. As you know, we are using it in various ways, mostly because for our developments. And you can see this map of the cumulative human impact. There is almost no place in the ocean that is not impacted by your activities. And the recent global assessment of the IPBES, the Intergovernmental Panel on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services, assessed the main drivers of biodiversity loss in the ocean, and overexploitation, and in particular overfishing, was shown as the main driver, followed by land and sea use change. But solutions do exist. The first one can be fisheries management. The problem with that is that for many species that we are harvesting, we don't have enough information on their biology, on their ecology, to do proper fisheries management strategies. So this is why spatial management can be very relevant, because it is an ecosystem approach, and in particular, marine protected areas. And why marine protected areas? Because they have recognized multiple social and ecological benefits. So here in this table, you can see on the lines, these are different area-based management tools. Many of those can be used for fisheries management. For example, you have gear restriction areas, fisheries closures, turfs, terrestrial user right fisheries that are used a lot in Chile, for example. So all these are area-based management tools. And the first three are a specific case of ABMTs that are marine protected areas. So they can be either fully protected areas where there is no fishing, no extractive activities, no mineral activity neither, partially protected areas where there is some form of extraction, and locally managed marine areas in many places of the Pacific, for instance, and some of them might qualify as MPAs. And here you can see the possible ecological and social outcome of all those ABMTs. And what you can see is that marine protected areas are the ones that can deliver the largest range of benefits across these social and ecological outcomes. And going back to the SDGs, also, the three forms of MPAs are the one contributing the most to SDG 14. So MPAs are very useful, can be very useful. And this is why, as you all probably know, there have been some international agreements to push countries to establish MPAs in their coastal and marine waters. In particular, there was the Aichi Target 11 of the CBD, so the UN Convention for the Biological Diversity. And there is one target of SDG 14 that specified that we need 10% of MPAs in countries' coastal and marine waters. Where we were in 2020 at 7%. So not yet at the target. Now we are at around 8%, a little bit lower than 9%. But I'm asking the question that is simple coverage really the best measure anyhow? Because when we were back at 7%, the first thing we could highlight was that only half of the MPAs that are reported by countries to the UN, to UNEP, were implemented. The other half were either proposed, so it's just a declaration, or designated points on a map, but no implemented measures at sea. So only half of those were implemented. And when we were looking at those half, we could see that only a third were fully protected areas. And I'm saying only because most of the scientific evidence, and we'll go back to that, on the benefit of MPAs were based on full protection. And when we are looking at those, these thirds of fully protected areas, we could see that most of them were a few very large MPAs in remote areas that were not yet quite impacted by overfishing and which were called residual areas. So most of the MPAs, where there is most of the protection, it is either very far from population or those that are close are partially protected, so not fully protected. So one can say it's not a problem. It's not important for MPAs to restrict totally fishing or to ban fishing. It's all about sustainability. So it's important to know how things happen inside an MPA because fisheries can be sustainable. And so what we did is we looked at impact of activities inside MPAs. So we developed what we call the cost-effective framework, which was quite simple to understand the intensity of activities within MPAs, and just knowing about a number of boats or a number of people and those kind of information. Quite something that was quite easy to obtain. And we conducted a study in several Mediterranean MPAs. And what we saw, obviously, in fully protected areas, there was no extractive threats. So all extractive threats could be removed from full protection. Okay, this is what they are meant for. Oh, I cannot move anymore my, okay. And in regarding non-extractive activities, what we were able to see is that many times they were increasing inside the fully protected areas compared to outside. So this means that when something is allowed inside the fully protected area, the intensity of this activity tends to be larger inside compared to outside. And most importantly, when we looked at partially protected areas, it was the same thing. We realized that when an activity was allowed inside an MPA, the intensity of this activity was larger inside the partially protected area compared to outside. So even if you regulate fishing in terms of length of nets or number of hooks along a line, for example, there will be more fisher or more fishing hours inside the MPA compared to outside. And these were only small coastal MPAs. So here it was quite well working on trawling, because anywhere trawling was banned inside those coastal areas. But another study conducted in the same year showed that in the North Sea, commercial trawling was larger inside marine protected areas compared to outside. And you have to understand something here, that we are not at all talking about illegal activities. It's activities that are allowed inside MPA. So yes, some trawling is allowed inside, some marine protected areas. So we wanted to do something about that and try to understand better what we were really protecting about MPAs, and are all MPAs worth the same thing, basically. And so we said there are a lot of different partially protected areas. So someone you can have trawling, someone you can't, somewhere fishing is more intense inside compared to outside. So we decided to develop, which was lacking, a classification system to understand the protection level of marine protected areas. So what we did, and don't look at the details of this table, just to show you an example, because it has evolved since this paper, because we have added many more fishing gears, but it's just to show you the historical developments of what we did. So we looked at different fishing gears that could happen inside or around MPAs. And we developed a gear score according to the impact those activities, those gears could have on fish, on species size, species numbers, and on habitats. So the more impacting the gear, the larger the score. And we combine that to develop a zone score, so a score for a given zone in an MPA, to understand the overall potential impacts of activities that are allowed inside this MPA. And we compared that to something that was existing before, which was the IUCN typology. And the IUCN typology was a way to classify MPAs, but mostly according to their objective. But very often, what is allowed or not, the regulations, the rules of an MPA are not necessarily in relation to the objective. And what we saw is first that many MPAs that were reported to UNEP with IUCN types were misreported. So we reclassified the IUCN typology, and we show first that there were a clear relationship between our zone score and the IUCN typology, but for given types, so those that are mostly from 4 to and above, which are all the partially protected areas, our zone score could see differences that were not being seen by the IUCN typology. And so to compute this score, it was quite complex because you had to know everything that was allowed or not inside an MPA. But we wanted to build a tool that is easy to run, useful for managers, and useful to compare MPAs at a global scale. And so what we did is we found the way that was the most simple, with the least number of steps of information that was required to, but that correlated the more to the complex score that we've developed. And this is what we've ended up to be. I won't say that in details because once again, I will show you just after how it has been incorporated into the MPA guide. But this was called the regulation-based classification system for marine protected areas. And with a simple set of 4 questions or less in some cases, it was possible to assign a score, so a given protection level to a zone or to an MPA according to the score of the gears that were allowed, the number of gears that are allowed, or the activities for, or the other type of activities. And as you can see, the least number of gears, the more question you have to answer to understand better for the very high levels of protection. But when you have trawling, for example, that is allowed, you just have to know that trawling is allowed and you know in which protection level you are, which is the lowest. Okay, and as you can see, we have unprotected as a protection level because you have marine protected areas that are declared marine protected areas, sometimes with the management body, with managers, sometimes doing very great job. They do monitoring, they do consultancies among different stakeholder groups, they receive school, they do awareness raising, they do a lot of things, but the regulations are not different between inside and outside of the MPA. And since we've developed this, now there have been a broader a group that decided to incorporate the regulation-based classification system with the agreements of UNEP, WCMC, so World Conservation Marine Center, WCPA, World Conservation Protected Area Commission of the IUCN. And basically, it is the same framework. So the regulation-based classification system is embedded into that. And you have a decision tree where you answer a different set of questions according to different activities that are allowed or not inside the MPA. And you end up with different fishing, different level of protection that you can see at the bottom here. And as you can see, there is not anymore the unprotected one, but it is now just incompatible with marine conservation because this is following the IUCN recommendation. And this is just a summary of the decision tree. And you can see that when you are in full protection, you don't have extracting activities, so no fishing, no dredging, no mining. When you are in a highly protected area, you can have some low impact sustainable fishing activities, but you can't have mining and dredging and dumping, for example. So this is a way to summarize what is allowed or not in the different protection levels. So this is a very similar approach to what was the regulation-based classification system. But what we did with the MPA guide on top of that, on top of the levels of protection, is to consider the stage of establishment. Because as I showed you at the beginning, half of the MPA that were assessed were only half were implemented. So with the MPA guide, on top of the levels of protection, we have also the stage of establishment, which go from committed to actively managed. And so a given MPA can be in all of those different rectangles because it can be potentially fully protected, but only committed, only so it's not at sea, for example. So as you can easily understand, MPAs, whatever the level of protection, as long as they are only committed or designated, they cannot be effective, okay? And now we are going to look at what types of level of protection are needed to for MPAs to be effective. So this is what we're going to see now, and I'm just giving you a spoiler alert of what it would be. So basically, the idea was to say we have now a classification. We can now classify MPAs according to the level of protection. And the level of protection is just an indicator of the potential impact of the activities that are allowed inside the MPA. But we thought that there were a clear relationship between the allowed activities and the effectiveness. So this is what we went to look for, and we did a meta-analysis. But first, I wanted to go back to the multiple benefits of marine protected areas. And they can be good for conservation. They increase fish biomass, fish size, fish numbers. They can export this biomass through spillover and benefit fisheries. They can contribute to the sustainable blue economy because they attract divers. They can be good to reduce coastal erosion because they can protect habitats like seagrass or mangroves or corals that reduce wave energy. They can be good for climate with mangroves, for example, etc. And so, but most of this information was based on fully protected areas, MPAs where extraction was forbidden. So what we did, we tried to assess those benefits, but to other levels of from the different levels of protection. So what we saw is that. So here you can see when we combine all MPAs together, on average, all partially protected areas together, on average, they were effective either for fish abundance or fish biomass. But when we split them according to their level of protection, we saw that only those that are highly or moderately protected area were effective. And the full protection was already documented, so we didn't add those in this analysis. And very importantly, for the we saw, as for fully protected areas, that the effectiveness was increasing with time and with the size of the MPA. So the larger the MPA, the older the MPA, the more effective the MPA. And regarding moderately protected area, which can be effective, there was a very interesting result that we saw was that when you have MPAs, very often they can be of multiple zones. So you can have a zoning inside the MPAs. And what we saw is that when you have a highly protected area, whether it is with or without a fully protected area, together inside the MPA, it works. Okay, weakly regulated MPA, whether they are with or without a fully protected area, there is never differences between inside and outside. Probably because there is too intense extractive activities inside the MPA. And moderately protected areas, they are effective at increasing fish abundance and fish biomass, but only when there is a fully protected area inside the MPA. And this is a very new result, so please don't tweet because there is an embargo until tomorrow end of the afternoon. This is a new study that we did, a new meta-analysis, and we saw some results that are very similar, that the effect of MPAs on carbon sequestration, on increase of catch per unit of effort, of increase of fishermen income, on average is positive. But is present only when there is a fully protected area and not when there are lower levels of protection. So to summarize that part, is really there is a clear link between the level of protection and the effectiveness of MPAs, and even the social or the socio-economic effect of MPAs, with full protection being the most effective. Highly protected area, they can be quite effective too, but then there is a very large qualitative change, and it is very difficult to see some benefits of lower levels of protection. So the health of the ocean really depends on the level of protection we have in our MPAs. So with the little time that remains for this talk, I'm going to do something, because we have seen that we have different levels of protection. We have seen that we have a way to track the level of protection, and we can see that there is a direct relationship between the level of protection and the effectiveness. So we can use the level of protection as an indirect indicator of MPA effectiveness. Of course, if there is enforcement, if there is co-management, if user rights are respected, etc. But there is a direct relationship between level of protection and MPA effectiveness. So if we look at the MPA, so let's start with the MED. So in the MED, we have a rainbow of protection. So a lot of MPAs. It was 6% when we did this study. So it was very close to the global number, which was 7%. And so you can see different colors. So first, NR was non-regulated. So MPAs that were only declared. There were no plan and no regulations, nothing that we found that can be used to classify them. We went from 6 to 4.5. And then a very important message of that is that when we look at this lighter color, UP for unprotected, so those MPAs that exist, that are sometimes well managed, that receive budgets, but when the activities that have an impact on biodiversity are not more regulated inside the MPA compared to outside, when we get rid of those MPA that are unlikely to provide any benefits, we go from 4.5% of MPAs in the MED to 0.3%. So there is the greatest majority of MPAs are just unprotected. So according to the MPA guide, they are just non-compatible with marine protection. And the MPA guide is just taking the guidelines of the IUCN. So for the IUCN, those MPAs are not compatible with marine protection. And if we keep only those that are the most effective, so the highly and fully protected areas, we go from 0.3 to 0.23. and only full protection. So where there is strong restriction on fishing, when fishing is banned, we are at 0.06% of full protection in the Mediterranean Sea. And there are large differences from among countries, as you can see, but full protection is very low in most countries. And as too often in the Med, for whatever we look at, there is differences between European and non-European countries, with more protection in European countries, but among what is being protected, higher protection levels in non-European countries. And there are differences also among ecoregion in the Med, with the Western Mediterranean being more protected and with larger levels of protection. But we can say, okay, the Northern European countries might do better than Southern European country and Mediterranean countries. But let's look at an example of Europe. So OSPAR. OSPAR, the North-Eastern Atlantic Regional Sea Convention. So the average, the total cover of MPAs of the OSPAR area was 7%. So same thing as the global number. So probably very good. But if we look at what types of MPA, we have a very similar picture. Because if we look at unclassified, so declared MPA without any plans, any regulations, and those that are unprotected, so non-compatible with marine protection, when there are no differences in regulations between inside and outside, it is 2/3 of the OSPAR MPA. So 4.6% of the OSPAR area and 2/3 of the OSPAR MPAs. So 2/3 of the MPA in OSPAR, they cannot deliver any conservation benefits because there are no differences in regulations between inside and outside. And they are then the other third are moderately protected areas. And we saw before that those MPAs can work, but they need full protection in a zoning in the MPA to be most useful. And when we look at how much full protection we have, I really need to count the 0x each time. So we have 0.0003% of the OSPAR area that is covered by full protection. So once again, the message here is that we have a lot of MPAs, not yet close to 10%, which was the target to 2020, but still we are not that far. But when we look at the level of protection of MPAs, we are very far to have MPAs that can really deliver the conservation benefits they are implemented for. And the Europe saw that because there was a report by the Court of Auditor that just said exactly that, and it was based partly on the results that we've developed on the level of protection, and say that marine protected area, they provide limited real protection. And why that? It's not necessarily because of limited funding. Of course, funding is always an issue, but it's just that the regulations are not there to provide any conservation benefits. So just before that, so now there is evidence that 10% is not enough of MPAs, and 30% should be a potential target. And this was a review that assessed many studies that look at targets according to different objectives. And you can see that 30% is the one that is shared among most of the studies. And this is why there was the High Ambition Coalition for Nature and People that is pushing for 30% of MPAs by 2030. It's called the 30 by 30 movement. Now the Europe, also in its 2030 biodiversity strategy, has as a main goal to have 30% and not anymore 10%, but 30% of MPAs by 2030, but with a third, so 10%, a third in strict protection, so where there is no fishing, non-extractive activities. And France has the same objective of 30% of MPAs by 2030, with a third being in strong protection, which is the French name. And so, since this is a target for France, let's look at French now. So we've seen the Met, we've seen some Northern European countries. Let's look in more details at France and the overseas. And France, as you may know, is an important player for ocean policy and in particular here ocean conservation, because it's the second largest marine territory in the world because of the overseas territories. So let's look at protection. So the 30% target is already reached in France. So there are already more than 30% of MPAs of coastal and marine French waters that are covered by an MPA. The level of protection are much larger in French overseas territories than in continental France. And this might be similar to what we saw before, the residual MPA. So when you have territories that are very far and sometimes with very low human activity, it might be easier to implement full protection there. And when we look at in detail, so there is 1.7% of full and high protection in France. So just to recall, the target is 10% of those level of protection. And 80% of this full and high protection, so those 1.7%, 80% of that is in the terres australes et antarctiques françaises, so Australian and Antarctic territories in the southern and southwestern Indian Ocean. So 80% of the largest level of protection in France is in this territory. And if we include some remote reefs of New Caledonia, more than 97% of those high levels of protection are in those very remote territories. So when we look in detail territory by territory, what we can see is that full and high protection in France, although there is more than 40% of declared MPAs in metropolitan France. So this is what France reports to the CBD, more than 44.5% of MPAs. Full and high protection is only 0.03%. And there are some other examples that we can see. For example, in Mayotte, so in the southwestern Indian Ocean, the whole EEZ is declared as an MPA. So 100% of Mayotte's territory, of Mayotte's marine territory is declared as an MPA, but 0.003% is being either fully or highly protected. So there is a gap between what we say we do and what we really protect. So once again, the level of protection really matters for how we manage the ocean. So just to conclude, a few key messages on how to potentially improve ocean health. That we've seen it is quite useful to classify our MPAs according to the MPA guide level of protection or stages of establishment to better understand the possible social and ecological outcomes we can expect from the MPA we have. And if we have too low levels of protection, we cannot expect much from our MPAs. So it's not only about quantity, it's also about quality. And so this is why when we have multiple sectoral MPAs, which are very important, it's good to have multiple zoning in MPA. It's good to have sustainable fishing inside MPAs. It's good to accommodate to different users and stakeholders inside MPAs. But when we do that, it is important to have full and high protection inside the zoning, because we've seen that even if we want MPAs to deliver positive benefit for fisheries, whether it is in terms of catch or in terms of fishers' income, it is important to have full protection. And in terms of global policy targets, it's important not to focus only on cover area. Okay, number is important. Probably without those 30% or 10% targets, we wouldn't have any MPAs to complain about. So of course, the number, the coverage is important, but it is important to have target on quality. And this is where potentially to use a protection level specific target for marine conservation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Joachim. That was scary. was not an upbeat talk there that you gave us, was it? Thank you very much. That was very interesting, and I think you guys have done an amazing job in pulling this together. I have a question, and I have a question just to remind the attendees they can send us questions and answers in the Q&A. But for the people from the Marine Board, we can't get into the Q&A, so we always get our questions in the chat. So Paula, one of the Marine Board officers, asked, how easy is it to access the information that you've used and the details about the activities? Because I imagine that's quite difficult. If it's not easy, which I assume it isn't, what would make assessing this information more straightforward?
Yeah, that's a very good question, because it was not easy at all. Sometimes this information is hidden in reports or in legal text. Sometimes it's easily available on website, but sometimes it's not. Sometimes countries, they centralize that information, sometimes they don't. And how so it was a very long process to obtain that information. It's not difficult in terms of skills, but for Europe and for the Med, we had to speak many different languages, obviously. But apart from that, it's very time consuming. And how to make that more easily accessible? I think that pushing to have targets that are protection level specific would be a way to force countries to make that information more easily traceable, public, and standardized. Because if countries would have to report for the protection levels of their MPAs or for the different zones within an MPA, for multi-zone MPAs, this information would have to be standardized and accessible in different places. And so by doing that, we are trying to make this information accessible, but there's still a long way to go. And we are assessing many countries, many different areas. Now we have the 100 biggest MPAs in the world that are being assessed. But we would do that much more easily if countries were playing the game, if we can say it like that. Yeah, once it becomes parts of what countries have to report to, this would be a great way forward.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, indeed. I imagine that would make things easier. I have a question that's kind of more related to the sort of the topic that was part of our position paper was really about networks of marine protected areas. And do you think that if you had these in a network that it would improve? I mean, I'm not sure if it would improve the protection, but it might actually improve how easily the areas can regrow.
Yeah. So this is documented, and I also have a paper that is coming out soon with the models that show that. So when you have networks, you don't necessarily increase the conservation benefits within the MPAs, but you increase the benefits in between MPAs that are part of the network. Mm-hmm. So yes, connectivity is very important. So there is a lot of activities at the European level and international level to know how to better connect MPAs one to another. And there is a lot of work and papers being published about how to make networks of MPAs climate proof. So how to ensure that where we put MPAs now will be the right place for when fish move according to climate change projection, etc. And this research is super important. I'm not saying something different, but we would, until we don't have MPAs that are providing the conservation benefits that we need. So unless we start to increase this level of protection, I don't see the point about having some fancy network of MPAs that are climate proof if they cannot deliver any benefits when they are in a place. So there is a very important need to work with MPAs that are really protected, where the P of MPAs, marine protected MPAs, mean really something.
Mm-hmm. And another question that maybe it is included in the way you've made your calculations, but how much do you include enforcement in the
another very relevant question, because there is a lot of evidence, and there have been many meta-analyses that showed, and this is common sense, but many common sense thing needs to be proven by science, that there is a clear relationship between effectiveness and enforcement, obviously. And there is a clear gap that when an MPA is enforced, it is effective. And when you have just a little bit of poaching, it loses most of its effectiveness. So enforcement is very important. So when we started to work on the regulation-based classification system, so the ancestor kind of the MPA guide, we thought about how to include enforcement because it was important. But we realized that there is no any objective way that can be standardized across MPAs to include enforcement. And we wanted to have something that can be used to compare MPAs that are established in the EU and in the South Pacific, in the US, but Northern and Southern America, I mean, anywhere globally. And enforcement, it's very difficult to measure it because by essence, it's something that is illegal most of the time. And counting the number of fines rangers can deliver is not necessarily the right thing to do because in some MPAs, they cannot even deliver fines. Counting the hours per day of surveillance is something difficult to obtain from any MPAs. And sometimes you can have MPAs in places where, for a given socio-cultural context, people tend to play more by the rules. So you need to survey less those MPAs, while you will need to survey more other kind of MPAs. So what can be useful as an indirect indicator of enforcement in a place might not be the right indirect indicator in another place. And so because of those many reasons, we didn't account for enforcement. So the numbers that are scary, as you say, it's not my words, they are yours, that we've seen about the amount of full and high protection of our ocean doesn't account for enforcement. So it's a conservative number. So the
even more scary than what I thought.
Yes.
That's what I thought. And actually just following on from that, specifically talking about France and having all these, not just France, actually quite a few of the previously colonial countries have large marine protected areas in areas very far away from their population. So they look good, but actually it doesn't have an impact on their population, right? That's essentially what it boils down to.
Yeah, and sometimes the impact can even be negative because if they are done like in a top-down approach without at all involving local communities, sometimes indigenous communities, they can be very socially negative. So they can be ecologically effective, but have very negative social impact, which is a bad thing because MPAs can deliver social, ecological and social benefits. Mm-hmm. So this is not the right way to do.
Yeah. So I wonder. Yeah, I mean, I don't know. I wonder because indeed, there's all these big MPAs that are declared far away from the coast. So could you do something like distance from capital, distance from capital city as a scale to look at what the actual influence of the MPA is on the country's population, if you know what I mean?
Yeah, and we've tried to do that, but there are now so many MPAs that are established. It's difficult to do that. So this is why it's important to have the protection level of all those MPAs and to do this kind of analysis per level of protection. Mm-hmm. And yeah, this is something that could be done. But to answer a bit differently to your question, I think it's not the right way to go to establish very large, high levels of protection away from where there is a lot of human use, because as I've tried to show that full protection, so where there is no fishing, can be very effective to provide fisheries benefit. And so I know most of the places that I know where there are full protection, at the beginning, there were opposition to this full protection. because when humans are like that, whatever it is, speed limits on the road or fishing limits at sea, people oppose to them, right? So I'm not saying it's an easy thing to do, but once the MPA is implemented and once it delivers its benefits, and the thing is that, yes, it takes 3 to 5 years to see benefit for fisheries. It can be a little bit more, but when fishers perceive the benefit of the MPA, they never want to get rid of those. I don't know fully protected MPAs where you have fishers opposed to them once they start to deliver benefits. And so the more we establish low levels of protection, the more we are creating opposition because people oppose to the idea of an MPA. And once those MPAs are established, they don't perceive any benefits of those MPAs. So they are even more against the MPAs because they have to go to consultancy meetings. It takes a lot of time. It takes a lot of their time, etc. And then the tool is not useful. So So why supporting MPAs? So the point is we should probably do less but better.
Okay, then we have a few more questions coming from my team here. From Angel. The question is, what is or was the impact of this assessment of this MPA assessment using the guide? Were the MPA management open to improving the situation and the protection level? I think you've just sort of described that. Maybe from a fisheries point of view, but from management as well.
Yeah, so very often it's not the managers themselves who decide the regulation of an MPA. Very often it's at the national level that happens because it's a long process involving many different groups, etc. So very often the managers, they don't have their hands on changing the rules. But it's been a while that we are publishing those assessments, and I don't know, it might appear not humble, but I'm trying to say that with a lot of humility. I think we've contributed to those dual targets now that we can see in Europe and in France of having 30% of MPAs, but 1/3, so 10% being strictly protected. This has been done after the report by the Court of Auditors on marine conservation and after we've been interviewed and have exchanged the work, etc. In France, it's the same thing. They've declared that after those results were issued, and of course, I've tried to communicate with them a lot. My point was not at all to name and shame when I do that, and I communicated a lot with French authorities even before publishing the paper. As soon as I got the results, they were informed on that. So I think that yes, doing those assessments helps to raise the awareness on the fact that we are not doing what we think we are with our MPAs. And it is a very long process. I think we should do faster than that, but I know how things work when you are in the decision-making process, etc. But I think we are on the way to get there. It's not as fast as it should for marine conservation, but I think this is the kind of impact we had.
Yeah, and I think you're precisely right. I don't think France is any worse than any of the other European countries, to be honest. I think, as I said, especially the old colonial countries have done a lot of that kind of stuff. We have another question from Paula, and I can see where it's coming from because she's busy working on a document on marine renewable energy, which obviously also has a space implication in the world, in the ocean. So she's saying, are we in danger of running out of space if you consider that we must protect, all marine protected areas? And can this MPA guide and its information be used for more other social economic assessments?
Yes and no, because I mean, running out of space, for example, France is declaring that the Mediterranean Sea, but the French part of the Mediterranean Sea, being covered at 60% by MPAs. You heard me well, huh? 60%. So 6 times 10. But because you can do whatever you want inside most of those MPAs, I don't see any conflicts of space because you have point on a map, but you don't exclude any activity. So in the end, there is not a lot of issues regarding that. But then a very powerful tool is to use multi-zoned MPA, which is a kind of a mini marine spatial planning approach to an MPA, because you can assign different areas to different users or combination of users, or to the same users, but with different types of activities, different gears, for example. And it might be a very good way to promote more sustainable practices. So the same kind of practice, for example, fishing or boating or whatever, but with more sustainable activities. So that can happen in higher level of protection, and with the benefits that would being exported from the MPA, you can please also the stakeholders that are excluded from the area. So if it is done in coordinated with all the stakeholders, co-managed with the stakeholders, I think it can be very well integrated into MSPs. And I think we can really cohabit between development and conservation, because I don't see at all any trade-off between conservation and sustainable development. Conservation is a pillar of sustainable development. We cannot have sustainable development without conservation. So I don't see a trade-off between one or the other. We need both.
Yeah, I think you're right. And indeed, maybe again, if you're talking about 60% of France being French Mediterranean area covered by de facto MPAs, maybe the communication we should have is that really having 60% is useless and actually counterproductive. And if you did it well in 10 to 30%, then you could use the other space more freely. And indeed, if you have appropriate marine spatial planning and actually enforcing what you've actually said in the laws, then you would have more space. So I think that's probably the bottom line that we should probably try and communicate to them.
Yeah, but use more freely outside, but being sustainable. I think
sure. Yeah,
it's good to have targets for marine conservation, but it's good to, 100% of the ocean should be sustainably managed, right? Yeah. And marine conservation, MPAs, is part of this objective.
Yeah. Very good. So I don't know if there's any other questions. I didn't see in the Q&A, there was one that was really just a comment that you're getting enemies. So that's just that it was a very amazing talk, but you have made some enemies, I suspect. I don't actually believe that. I actually think it's quite important to point out that it's no use doing something halfway, because then actually you're shooting yourself in the foot, Yeah,
so I hope it is. And even if I have enemies, which is a bit the case, I sleep well because I think I'm working for the common goods. So
yeah, very good. So thank you very much. One final question from me, I guess. This is obviously, we're talking about marine protected areas. These are only within national EEZs, right? So we still have a huge chunk of the ocean out there that's not at all protected in the areas beyond national jurisdiction. So do you have any ideas of how we could do that? Because you can't really protect something if you're not actually going to protect it. If nobody takes care of it.
This is planned. So there is an ongoing negotiation at the UN, and I'm part of the French delegation in that as an expert on MPAs and ABMTs in general, area-based management tools. And so there are 4 pillars to this negotiation on the conservation and sustainable use of biodiversity beyond national jurisdiction. And one of those pillars are ABMTs, area-based management tool, including marine protected areas. So there will be the ability of establishing marine protected areas on the high seas. So areas beyond national jurisdiction. most of what remains to be agreed upon is how this new COP, because it will be a kind of BBNJ COP, will coordinate with RFMO, so Regional Fisheries Management Organization. Because if for a given MPA in the high seas, some fishing regulations are needed in the MPA, the BBNJ COP might not be able to take those regulations because it cannot undermine the mandates of sectoral and regional management organization. So it has to convince the RFMO to take the regulations. So here we will see clearly at one point the states are schizophrenic or not, because the parties who will be at the BBNJ COP who would want to establish an MPA are the same countries that are behind the RFMOs. Okay, they might send different people negotiate, but they are the same countries. So this is where we're going to see if all those countries saying, yeah, we're going to establish MPAs on the high seas, really want to do what they say they want, or if we have unprotected marine protected areas on the high seas.
Yeah, and then you talk about RFMOs, which is about fishing, but then we're also talking about deep sea mining.
Yeah, and deep sea mining.
I mean, that's another. And the problem, I think, is that those are three different ministries in most countries, right? So that's the problem, is that they don't within country think of the consequences of one or
yeah, that's a huge problem, and something I say very often. To me, the main, so for IPBES, the main threat to marine biodiversity is overfishing, and to me the main threat to biodiversity is fragmentation of ocean governance. Because you have regional sea conventions, you have the high seas, you have the ISA for deep seabed mining, you have BBNJ for the water column, but without fishing because it's RFMOs, but without boat traffic because it's the IMO. You have all this kind of stuff. And within the country, as you have just said, there are different agencies or different ministries going there. So as long as we don't have people coordinating and talking one to another who negotiate in those different conventions, it's a bit useless because we are really schizophrenic.
Yeah, yeah. And on that very depressing note, thank you very much, Joachim. This is great. It was a wonderful discussion and really a great talk. So thank you very much.
Sorry to interrupt, but I really hope it's not depressing. I think that identifying the problem is really the beginning of the solution, you know. So so now we can think about solution, and some are quite easy, you know. Let's just increase the levels of protection, you know?
Yeah, indeed. No, you're very right. So thank you very much again. So I think we have a few minutes left. So the only thing that's left is for me to say that again, thank you all for your participation. And thank you for listening. And just to let you know that our next webinar will be on Thursday, the 17th of November, and it'll be by Dr. Frederic Bertucci. And he is going to be talking about underwater acoustics in a changing world, from individuals to conservation. It will be based on the science that's gone into our very newest, or second to last newest, future science brief from last year on addressing underwater noise in Europe. So we'll go from marine protected areas to addressing underwater noise in next month. So thank you very much, and thank you again, Joachim. That was a great discussion. We'll see you again.
Thank you.
In person sometime.
Bye bye.
Thank you. Bye.